All right, so in the last video, we began our look at Era 3 of the APUS history curriculum and covered the French and Indian War, which was topic 3.2, particularly its causes and effects. In this video, for topic 3.3, we will look at the issue of taxation without representation. As the wars for empire had been so expensive, the British government sought to raise revenue from the colonies to pay for their continued protection. Parliament had long before passed navigation acts that limited colonial trade, including requiring certain goods to be sold only in England and for ships and crews to be of all British origin. But these laws, passed as early as the 1650s, were largely ignored, and the British really didn't expend much effort to enforce them anyway. The intent behind them was to keep all of the benefits of trade inside the empire and to minimize the loss of gold and silver to foreigners, essentially putting into law the economic policy known as mercantilism, whereby the colonies were expected to provide benefits to the mother country. But because of internal troubles in England itself, especially with the Glorious Revolution and the trouble with the succession from William and Mary, and then Mary's sister Anne, both dying childless, and then having to go to Mary and Anne's second cousin, Sophia of Hanover, to find a Protestant heir and presumably the next monarch, she would have actually become Queen Sophia of England had she not died just 2 months before Anne. Instead, it was Sophia's eldest son who became King George I and the founder of the Hanoverian dynasty of British monarchs, even though he knew little English and spent a tremendous amount of time on the continent. George II did better in this area, but with 2 uprisings to attempt to restore first James, the son of James II, to the throne, the monarchy, and Parliament's attention, their attention was really on the goings-on at home and not on the management of the colonies, a period that is generally referred to as salutary neglect. Once he came to power after the death of his grandfather, George III sought to change that. To begin to regain control over the colonies, British Prime Minister George Grenville implemented a 3-part plan. The first part of the plan included stricter enforcement of the Navigation Acts, which colonists had regularly ignored through smuggling. Then came the Sugar Act of 1764, which replaced an earlier Molasses Act of 1733. The old law had placed a tax of 6 pence per gallon on molasses imported into the colonies. The new one would cut that in half, but this time it would be enforced. The colonists objected to it, although primarily because of an economic depression that was ongoing at the time it was enacted. They didn't particularly object to the taxation itself because it still followed the old format of taxing merchants and shippers, but they didn't like that Parliament wasn't just using its taxation powers for the regulation of trade, as they had limited to themselves before. This time they were actively raising revenue with the law. Still, though, smuggling continued. Yet another law passed by Parliament during this period of increasing tension was the Quartering Act. It was passed because militias were seen as too amateur to provide for defense. Therefore, a standing army would be kept in the colonies during peacetime, something that had never been done before. The law provided that troops would be kept in barracks and public houses, but if not enough space were available, they could be quartered in inns, the homes of people involved in certain businesses, vacant buildings, barns, and other buildings, and the owners of those buildings did not need to consent, and the colonies themselves would have to pay for the costs. Then came the worst one of all, the Stamp Act. Because the Sugar Act was not generating enough revenue, due to the continued smuggling, Parliament in London decided to come up with a new means of raising money to support military efforts and defense in the colonies. What they came up with was the Stamp Act in 1765, which would require special revenue stamps to be placed on most printed paper in the colonies, including things like legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, advertisements, even playing cards would be subject to this tax. The law was different than previous ones because this was the first direct tax on the colonists, the first time that tax was placed on the users of goods rather than on the merchants, although obviously merchants would just pass along the cost of the tax. But the colonists saw that as a distinct difference. In general, the colonists were livid and immediately began protesting, actually long before the act even went into effect. There were impassioned speeches in the various colonial legislatures, including one by Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where he demanded the king's government recognize the rights of all citizens, including their right to only be taxed by their elected representatives. There was the formation of secret societies like the Sons of Liberty, who took it upon themselves to intimidate tax collectors, tarring and feathering them even, driving them out of town, even destroying the stamps before they could be issued. There was the calling of the Stamp Act Congress held in New York in 1765, which had 27 delegates from 9 colonies who then passed a resolution uniting the colonies that specified that only the colonies' elected representatives could place direct taxes on them. And since the colonies had no direct representation in Parliament, Parliament could not tax them. But still, perhaps the most effective means of protest were the boycotts. Between 1765 and 1766, it became fashionable in the colonies to not purchase any article of British origin, even if it meant spending more money. Colonial importers and merchants in London demanded Parliament take action to restore trade with the colonies, because financially they were hurting. By 1766, the Stamp Act was in fact repealed, and the colonists celebrated. But they paid little attention to the Declaratory Act that Parliament passed at the same time, which stated that Parliament had the right to tax and make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. There was still the issue of the expenses of defending the colonies and managing the empire. Charles Townshend, a member of Parliament, noted that since the colonists did not seem to object to taxes on trade, so he proposed the Townshend Acts in 1767 that would place taxes, specifically import duties, on a variety of products, including tea, glass, paper, lead, and paints. The money raised would pay for the salaries of Crown officials, instead of having the colonial legislatures pay those Crown officials, because the legislatures often used the threat of withholding their salaries in order to force those appointed officials to do what the legislature wanted them to do. Anyone who was suspected of smuggling could have their homes and businesses searched with the application of what was known as a writ of assistance, which, although vaguely like a search warrant, did not require any actual evidence of wrongdoing. Naturally, of course, there were protests. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania sent a series of letters to be published in London newspapers, unsigned, of course. He argued that the duties that were being imposed were not for the regulation of trade and were, in fact, direct taxes. And since no taxation without representation was a central principle in English law, Parliament was violating the law. Although his letters generated discussions throughout London, it was once again the boycotts, encouraged by what was called the Massachusetts Circular Letter, that encouraged the colonies to plead for repeal, and in the meantime, that boycott of British goods and to encourage smuggling and buy goods from outside of the British Empire. That's what's going to have the effect, because imports from Britain is going to plummet and London merchants will go to Parliament and demand relief. In 1770, the new Prime Minister, Lord Frederick North, agreed and felt that these acts needed to be repealed because they were damaging to trade. And all were repealed, except for a tax on tea, which was left in place as a symbol of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Before the colonists could be made aware of the repeal of the Townshend Acts in March of 1770, a group of Bostonians gathered near the customs house, the tax collector's house, wanting the customs official there to be sent out to face the angry colonists. A contingent of soldiers protecting the house faced off against those colonists when someone shouted the word fire. A gun goes off, and the soldiers respond. And in the aftermath, 5 colonists were killed, with at least 6 more wounded. The soldiers were arrested and put on trial in the city of Boston for murder. But they were acquitted when their defense attorney, future President John Adams, and a noted patriot and no lover of the British, was able to produce numerous witnesses who swore that it had not been the commander of the soldiers who had given any sort of order to fire, and that the crowd wasn't simply a group of peaceful protesters, but was instead an angry mob, regardless of what many of the newspapers in town were depicting. All of the men were acquitted of murder, although 2 of the 8 were convicted of manslaughter. Many Americans, like Samuel Adams, were enraged by the outcome of the trial, believing that there had been a miscarriage of justice. After the Boston Massacre, the years through 1772 did represent a bit of a break from political trouble, and the colonies began to enter a period of economic prosperity. But during this time, some of those colonists tried to keep alive the view that British officials were deliberately conspiring against colonial liberties. They began what were called committees of correspondence, starting in Massachusetts, where they exchanged letters between various towns describing suspicious or potentially threatening British actions, so that the colonists, regardless of where they lived within Massachusetts, could be informed of what the British authorities were up to, essentially setting up a letter-writing spy network. It wasn't long before this idea spread to other colonies, and you even had the establishment of intercolonial committees allowing for communication between the colonies, reporting on the same thing as the committees of correspondence did within each colony. These began to promote more patriotism, as well as more manufacturing at home, encouraging Americans to do without luxuries, and of course, once again, encouraging Americans to boycott British products. And once the Continental Congress began meeting in the fall of 1774 and decided to make an official boycott of British products, these intercolonial and local committees began examining the records of various merchants and determining who was still importing goods and publishing those names of anyone who was thought to be trying to defy the boycott, so that, everybody else could put pressure on them to stop as well. These committees overall, but especially the one in Maryland, would be instrumental in establishing that First Continental Congress. In June of 1772, this respite from trouble came to an end when a British customs ship, the Gaspee, was lured onto a sandbar off the coast of Rhode Island and destroyed by colonists in the middle of the night. As they set it on fire and it burned to the waterline. The British investigated to see if they could figure out who was responsible, but they were never able to discover that information, as members of the Sons of Liberty refused to identify any of their members who may have taken part, not that they ever identified who their members were anyway. Then in the spring of 1773, Parliament passed a law regarding the East India Tea Company in an effort to save it from bankruptcy. The law would allow East India tea to be imported into the colonies without any duties in England, other than the standard tax on tea that was going to be charged once it reached the colonies. This would actually make East India tea cheaper than even the smuggled tea, but the colonists still weren't purchasing it because to do so would support Parliament's declaration that they had the right to tax the colonies. And so the tea sat in various warehouses unsold. By December of 1773, 3 more East India ships loaded with tea had arrived in Boston Harbor. One of them was connected to the son of the royal governor of that colony. But the warehouses in Boston weren't buying, and so the tea sat on board the ships, which had to land the tea and pay the tax that was owed within 20 days, or they would risk their cargo being confiscated. Hearing of this tea sitting in the harbor, members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves, some as Mohawk Indians, boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Some supported these actions as a justified defense of colonial liberties, but others felt this went too far because this was destruction of private property, as this wasn't government-owned tea. The government had simply given an advantage to tea that was owned by this company. And when it was reported that some tea had managed to land elsewhere, the Sons of Liberty actively hunted it down and even staged smaller tea parties well into March of 1774. These actions in Boston even inspired other tea dumping demonstrations in places like Maryland, New York, and even South Carolina. On hearing of Boston's actions, Parliament's reaction was swift and harsh, at the orders of the king, though the colonists still believed that it was Parliament taking the lead. The Boston Port Bill was passed in March of 74 and closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act reduced the power of the colonial legislature and increased the power of the colonial governor, since the legislature didn't appear to be doing much to help find those who had been responsible. The Administration of Justice Act would allow royal officials accused of any crime to have their trials moved to London and away from the growing resentment towards government officials in the colonies. And then there was the expansion of the Quartering Act, which was expanded and would apply to all colonies, those first 3 laws only applying to Massachusetts. Collectively, these laws are called the Coercive Acts because they're meant to coerce the colonists into cooperation and submission. But take a moment here and study the image of the cartoon titled The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. What do you see? Do you suppose this was produced from an American or from a British perspective? And what is it that makes you think that? And look at Britannia in the background. She's hiding from what is happening right in front of her. Now, alongside these coercive acts, Parliament was also finally getting around to organizing Canada, which of course it had acquired at the end of the French and Indian War. In June of 1774, they passed the Quebec Act, which would do 3 basic things towards that end. First, it would recognize Catholicism as the official religion of the Quebec province, which means it would be a tax-supported religion. And second, a government was created for Quebec, but it was one that would not have any sort of representative assembly. All of the officials would be appointed by the Crown. And third, the borders of what was defined as this Quebec province would be extended southward, all the way to the Ohio River. And the colonists were particularly angry over these 3 provisions because they, first of all, were offended by the idea that Catholicism was recognized by the British government, because remember, the king is the head of the English Church, which is Protestant. And with regards to Quebec not having a representative government, a lot of colonists were worried that similar laws could be passed affecting them, causing them to lose representation and even threatening their original charters. And they also felt that the Quebec Act was a direct tax on them because it was taking away land that various colonies claimed, particularly Virginia and Massachusetts, based on their original charters. So as you can see, the tensions were increasing tremendously, mostly over the issue of taxation and the lack of representation in Parliament between Britain and the colonies. And really, this is all about Britain's attempts to assert their imperial authority and the gradual unification of the colonies in response.